Good morning. Welcome to RBC Disruptors. I'm John Stackhouse. It's my pleasure to host our monthly conversation about disruption, innovation, and how technology is changing everything around us. To our audience on Facebook and WebEx, welcome. Please share your questions. We'll get to them on the screen here. And to our audience here at Water Park Place, welcome as well. Join the conversation through Facebook. We'll go through as many questions as we can today. Our guest today is Reddy. Ray's the co-founder and CEO of Ritual. It's a mobile ordering app that lets users discover, order, and pick up coffee and lunch and much more. How many here in the audience use Ritual? Okay, you all know what Ritual does. That's amazing. You've got a good following here. Well done, Ray. Here's what you may not know about Ritual. It's now in over 5,000 restaurants in 16, and that's probably grown by in the last 24 hours, cities across North America, Europe, and Australia. By year's end, Ritual will be in more than 40 North American cities and aims to triple its restaurant count. So Ray, congratulations on what you're building at Ritual, and thank you for joining us here at RBC Disruptors.
Thanks for having me.
You've talked about digitizing the local marketplace. As our video said, this isn't just about food. It's really about the local marketplace. I wonder if you can start by telling us about the origins of Ritual and why you did start with food.
Yeah, so I spent 4 years at Google leading the product team for shopping and commerce there, and I think one of the things that we just observed was that digital had changed just many different sectors and many different aspects of how people shopped and very recently transportation, but local was one of those things where there'd been many attempts but just not a lot of success. And I think one of the things we learned at Google was something that Larry Page used to call the toothbrush test, which was if you can use something twice a day, it starts to become habit forming. And when we looked at local, one of the biggest challenges was most things are very infrequent. We don't transact with a hair salon or things like that often enough for it to become a habit. But food's one of those things that people do. For many people, it is twice a day. So we thought that was a good starting category if you really cared about frequency.
So we'll get to the importance of frequency and the habits, but also the data that come with that. I want to start though with a couple of snappers and just get a sense of your own rituals or habits. Maybe you can just answer some quick questions about
Sure.
about your habits. Favorite food to order?
In the winter, a lot of soups and wraps. Yeah.
Summer?
Try to keep it lighter with salads.
Biggest frustration you've got with food pickup?
I mean, wasting time is just a huge frustration. So lineups annoy me.
We'll get to the lineup challenge. Last home cooked meal for you?
Made a roast chicken a couple of days ago. So,
nice.
Yeah.
So there's a future in home cooking still.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you talked a bit about why food. Give us some insight into why Toronto, and maybe talk about your strategy also for Toronto, where you almost went block by block. Why did you start with Toronto?
Yeah, we moved back from the Valley to Toronto to start Ritual. I'm from Toronto. That was a big part of it. We also, I think one of the things we observed about the Valley was that incomes there are so disconnected from reality when you look at the rest of North America, that there's a lot of things that can work in Silicon Valley that don't necessarily work outside of Silicon Valley. So I think we really wanted a city that felt representative of the rest of North America. So just an East Coast city with a financial hub, and Toronto. And I think it's really worked for us. Our belief is that if it worked in Toronto, it would work in most other cities, and that's definitely played out to be true.
So just dialing it back, you went to your family's from Dubai, moved to Canada. You went to Waterloo, then to the Valley and worked for Google. Mm-hmm. What brought you back here?
I think those two things. It was partly family and partly that we believed that doing something in Toronto was more. If it were with local, it's like you're trying to build a model of something and then you're trying to scale it out 100 times over many different cities. And so if you can get it right in the first city, and that is representative of the other cities, that's helpful, right? As opposed to having to. So I think one of the things that's been unique for us is that very little has changed as we've gone from Toronto to other cities, which just shows that it took us many iterations to get it right in Toronto, but when we got it right, it kind of worked across, most of the other cities that we've gone to.
Talk a bit about those early days with getting Ritual going, because it's not just about launching an app and hoping people will use it. You have to work actively with restaurants. What was your thinking?
Yeah, I think our observation on why prior to Ritual, there'd been a number of attempts on how to connect people with local businesses. So Groupon attempted to do that with a deals angle. There'd been a lot of different loyalty programs. Even recently, I don't know if any of you have heard of Vicinity, but that was something that existed in Canada for a long time. So there's just been 4 or 5 different, actually even much more than that, attempts to do this. And what we believed was the reason why most things had failed was in the software. It was just what we call like coverage or density. So if you, for example, if you work in this building, and we said, well, we have 5,000 restaurants on Ritual, that actually doesn't matter to you because most of you probably spend all of your time and your dollars in the Water Park Place food court. And if there are 7 restaurants there and we have 1, that's just not compelling, right? The product doesn't work well. But if we have 6 or 7 of them, then it actually doesn't matter whether we have 5,000 restaurants or not. The product is compelling for the people who work in this building, right? So I think a lot of other companies took a large numbers view of things, and big companies really struggle with this because it has to be national because they're national or global companies. And this is actually one of the benefits we had of being a startup and being small was it was okay for us to focus on a neighborhood or a building, and that's actually how we started. We proved this by making it work in one single building at 488 Wellington for 200 people with 15 restaurants around them. And we said if we can make it work for this 200 people, then we can scale that, right? Building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood. And it seems time consuming and that it would take forever. And we figured out how to do a lot of stuff in parallel. But
so what was the hardest thing in the first building of getting that right?
I wouldn't say that there were a lot. I think what we did was we tried to test it with the minimum amount of fanciness, right? So we built a bare bones app, and actually our belief was that how pretty the app was didn't really matter. And so if you look, I call it the cringe test. So if you're going to try a lot of things and you expect to have a high failure rate, you can't polish everything to a high degree and then fail at a lot of things. So what we focus on is how do you get things out really fast. And sometimes in fact, we've gotten out fast enough if it's almost slightly embarrassing. Because if it's beyond that, then we've probably spent too much time, right? And so again, that's how we looked at our first test, which was let's get at the most bare bones. The technology term for that would be like minimum viable product. Yep. But I think we take it down a notch and get it.
What's below minimum MVP?
Barely MVP.
Sub MVP.
And so in 3 months we were able to put together a prototype, get the restaurants we needed on board, and we didn't even publish the app in the App Store. We actually went and manually side loaded it onto people's phones, just went office by office and just did.
You're just going up to strangers saying, "Do you want?"
We went up to tenants in our office. There were other tenants on different floors, and we told them what we were doing and asked them if they wanted to be part of our beta, and most of them agreed to, and we bought them a free lunch and they tried it out. So that's still what we do today, in fact.
And then you just went building by building, block by block.
Well, we went neighborhood. So then after that, we kind of scaled that to neighborhoods. And what we realized was that the unit of value for users was a neighborhood, not a city. So if you could define neighborhoods in that way and get high coverage, that's what made it useful, right?
So Toronto gives you the density for that. That makes sense. I'm glad you mentioned Groupon because it brought back memories of peak Groupon. And in my neighborhood, there was a butcher shop, which I think around peak Groupon got a deal spread across the GTA, and there were literally lineups up the street, and drove the place out of business. They just got clobbered. So there was just this inability of the local merchant to cope with the demand surge that a platform like Groupon could deliver. How do you work with the suppliers, so the coffee shops and restaurants in your case, so that they can think through and manage those demand surges that digital is so powerful at creating?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the biggest differences between a marketplace company like ours and a software company that would sell software to a restaurant is we take ownership of the end experience. So what that means is when a customer orders a coffee and goes to pick it up, and something goes wrong, they can tell why it went wrong, whether that was on our side or the restaurant side or something in between. And so what that means is we have to take like end-to-end responsibility for that experience. So we can draw this line and say, okay, this is where software ends and in-store operations begins. So in fact, there've been many times during high peak periods that our own staff have actually like literally got behind the counter and helped out in a line to help throughput keep up with demand sometimes. So I think we get pretty involved in restaurant operations and restaurant layout design for newer restaurants, food court design, as a lot of the buildings we work with are undergoing, how do they design for the next 10 years kind of thing. So I'd say I think what we learned was simply injecting orders into a restaurant is not enough. We have to figure out how to deliver a compelling experience to the user, beyond that, right? And so we don't really draw a boundary on how far we'll go. It's all the way from insights and data to streamlining operations. It's not. I would say it's not stuff that we want to do, but I think for us, we have to do it to deliver the right experience to people.
So that's a pretty interesting risk for an entrepreneur to take on, that end user experience. And I imagine there's interesting conversations with the other entrepreneurs who feel they control the counter, they control the customer experience, but you wear it if it doesn't work out.
Yeah, we both wear it. You mean when you say the other entrepreneurs, you mean like the restaurant operators? Yeah.
The operator.
Yeah. Look, I think this is their livelihood, right? And they care deeply about their business. And so I think the good news is we're aligned. They want the same thing that we want. We've got a joint customer, and they start a restaurant because they want to deliver great experiences to people, right? And so we just help them do that. And so in some cases we take the lead on things like data and insights, best practices, like, hey, stores like you have solved this problem in this way, maybe you should consider doing it like that. So we bring a lot of knowledge, insights, data, but ultimately them and their staff are the ones executing it, and they are the frontline interface to our user.
So you become like a Google Analytics for a lot of these restaurant operators.
Yeah, a big part of, we've made a really big investment now in sort of becoming the operating system for the digital operating system for a restaurant. And so, our new restaurant portal it exactly looks like a version of Google Analytics for a restaurant, like their customers, how often they come, what is their spend, what is their lifetime value, just a lot of basic questions that most businesses would want answered.
So I'm trying to think through your business model, how you make money off of this, because that all sounds fantastic and really expensive. Putting a staffer behind a counter of someone else's shop is going to cost you, not the restaurant operator.
Yeah.
How do you make money at this?
Well, we take a transaction fee. So again, we're very aligned with our restaurant partners. The idea is that Ritual generates incremental demand, and we help them fulfill that incremental demand, and we take a transaction fee for that demand. So if we don't drive any orders, they don't pay us any money. If we drive a lot of orders, they pay us a bunch of money. Not everything. I think one of the benefits you have of being small is we're not putting people behind counters at scale, and it's okay for it to happen a handful of times. And what we learn from that is how to systemize something so that it isn't that painful for us to put people behind counters. And so I think one of the things that we've learned is there's there's a saying that it's often said in tech, I think, which is, don't be afraid of doing things that don't scale, right? And so I think one of the benefits we have is because we're not operating at massive scale. We're not thousands of employees, we're hundreds. We can do these types of things because it's the right thing to do to deliver the right experience to our customer, and then we figure out how to make it better and how to not have that happen again, right?
So it's a fascinating line. Don't be afraid of doing things that don't scale. Sounds like a bit antithetical to the Google way, where everything has to
even Google did a
to
lot.
Scale.
Well, I think even Google did a lot of things that didn't scale in the very beginning. And I think the whole point is that that's how you learn, and that's what helps you scale is how do you turn those things that, because if you have to build everything in a way that's scalable day one, you move too slowly. You can't ever experiment. You can't fail at anything because it's going to take you a year to build it in a scalable way as opposed to a week to just try it out, right? So I think we're fans of just trying things out fast, failing at a lot of them, but then when something works, then figure out how to scale it.
You're not the only one to have tried this. Why do you think you're succeeding where others have not?
I think a few reasons. I think one of the things we're benefiting from, Google wasn't the first search engine; they were the last search engine to enter search. We've benefited greatly from everyone else's failures, right? The 15 or 20 companies before us that have tried, including big ones that have done similar things and failed. We've been able to analyze why they failed, and I think it's actually a rare example we haven't had very many sort of pivots, and we had this thesis from the very beginning. The reason why most things haven't worked in local was this lack of coverage, that everyone took a country view or a global view or a city view, and we were going to take a neighborhood view. I think that's been the reason, and it's hard to execute, but a very simple insight.
So before we talk about your global expansion, maybe you can give us a bit more insight on your thinking about what you've called the last frontier of digital, this local economy. First of all, how do you define it? We're thinking restaurants, but you have a kind of a different perspective of the local economy.
My sort of very simple, my simple framework of describing most technology is just analog to digital. So if you think about most big technology companies like Google, Uber, even Facebook, they've all digitized something that was previously done in a very analog way. So if you think about information and how all the information existed, it was just really difficult to access. Advertising has existed offline forever. Google digitized that part of it. If you think about transportation, you could always hail a taxi. It was cumbersome and very analog. And with the ride-sharing apps, it's now a digital platform that connects. So digital just connects people. It's either people to businesses, people to people, and most of what these businesses do was possible before. They just make it more efficient. It's better. It's not anonymous, right? So we just believe digital is better. And so the way you shop has been digitized, right, through Amazon and e-commerce overall. But the way that you discover and interact with local restaurants is still sort of very analog. And prior to Ritual, the way that you bought a coffee, the way that you bought lunch, hadn't changed since the credit card. That was like the last major innovation, 25 years ago. And so we think, again, digital will fundamentally change how people discover local businesses, the type of relationship they have with them, and that's the kind of the transformation that's underway.
What are the biggest challenges in getting local businesses to adopt this kind of thinking?
So I think we're past the point right now. So 5 years ago, I think the biggest challenge was 5 years ago, local businesses saw this. It's very analogous to e-commerce. So if you think about like retail, I think that's one way to forecast what's going to happen with local is to just look at what happened with retail 10 years prior, right? And so, at first, why would you sell online? You'd do it because it provided a bit of incremental revenue, right? And so that's why a lot of restaurants started partnering with third parties, be it us or delivery companies. It was a way to generate 5 to 10% more revenue from the storefront that you had. But I think over time, what starts to happen is you realize that that is going to be your business, right? So in retail now, it's swapped. It's walk-ins aren't your primary business is online, and I think we're starting to see that transformation happen now. And I think the switch is going off in the heads of a lot of local operators. That, in fact, for many restaurants today, if you add up Ritual and a lot of the other third parties that they partner with, it makes up more than 50% of their sales or revenue. So they already are digital first businesses. Their primary source of revenue comes from digital, not walk-ins, right? And that's a transformative shift. But stores weren't designed for this, right? So I think, again, it's a similar problem that retailers had. They first tried to fulfill e-commerce orders through stores and then realized that was just not the right way to do it. And so I think there's a lot of innovation that's happening right now. Things like dark kitchens, having dedicated fulfillment centers just for delivery, for example, and just rethinking how to lay out a store. Even simple things. If 70% of people have already ordered before they've come into a store, why do you need a menu board, right? And even will we need, if you look at what's happening at McDonald's now, if you look at the new store formats, when you walk in, there's one cashier, not six, right? There's more people focused on fulfillment. And in fact, when you walk into McDonald's now, the first thing you see is not the menu board. You see it's traffic control. It's here are the orders waiting for prep and when they're going to be ready. And so I think it's small things like that, but it's also really large things like the fundamental layouts of stores have to change.
So let's go deep on this and how the whole restaurant business is being turned upside down. But if you're watching on Facebook or WebEx, please share your questions. And special shout out to the crowd at York University that's watching. Want to get your questions, and we'll insert those in the conversation. Ray, you mentioned dark kitchens. Maybe you can explain what that is and what's going on in the restaurant world.
Yeah, so I think again, sort of analogous to retail. A lot of restaurants have realized that it doesn't make sense to pay to use your highest rent stores to deliver. If you have 8 stores, for example, delivering out of all of them may not make sense. Instead, why not pick the lowest volume store that you have, or open a new store? So in some cases, when you look outside of downtown cores, they're actually placing. A dark kitchen is a kitchen that's not open to the public. It's a delivery-only, almost food fulfillment center, and typically what restaurants are trying to do now is put them in easy access areas. So think about like where multiple highways intersect. So it's like logistically easy to deliver out of them. It's low rent, so they could even be in like an industrial area. Because it's just food is being prepped there and being sent out. So you're seeing all kinds of just real estate is changing in terms of how restaurants think about where to put their restaurants. Another aspect that we're seeing is if 60 or 70% of your orders aren't coming from walk-ins, why pay high rent to locate your restaurant on a busy street, when the vast majority of people are actually discovering you digitally through an app? All of a sudden, like location matters, but being on the busiest street doesn't. And there's a lot of arbitrage there, because sometimes being on the street next to it that doesn't get all the traffic can have a dramatic reduction in rent. And so there's all kinds of interesting just physical world implications of what digital will do.
Are we going to have fewer restaurants 10 years from now?
I don't think so. But I think what is a restaurant is an interesting question. What we're starting to see happen also is, in some cases, there's actually virtual restaurants. So there's restaurants that exist. It's one kitchen that's branding themselves as cooking 6 different types of food. And so in certain apps, we don't have this on Ritual, but on other apps, like there are restaurants that don't exist anywhere but in the app. So it would be like a sushi shop that also happens to sell, I mean, I don't know, like dumplings, but you can't buy it through the store. You can only buy it, through the app, and maybe a delivery person will deliver that to you. So it's hard to say what exactly is a restaurant. Is it a brand? And if so, I think there's going to be more brands than exist today. And if it's the volume and choice of food, no, I don't think that's going down. I think what we're seeing is a proliferation of, and I actually think what's going to happen is we're going to help operators make better choices. So again, we can already predict a mismatch of demand and supply in an area. So for example, there's not enough of a certain cuisine type in an area. And that's an interesting opportunity for either an entrepreneur, a restaurant entrepreneur, to say, okay, this is the right. There's an opportunity to fulfill demand here, but it's also an opportunity for existing restaurants to maybe go into an adjacent cuisine type and expand their menu and say, let me also address that problem, right? So I think there's a lot of implications, and I think if anything, it's going to expand choice.
So what you're talking about resonates probably for every consumer-facing business, including financial services. The food business, though, has amazing spikes, peaks and valleys of demand. Like we eat at midday. How do you foresee that changing, and how does technology help maybe even smooth that demand even a little?
Yeah, we were just talking about this before the session outside. I think just like you mentioned, the supply-demand mismatch in the restaurant space is, I think, the most significant mismatch I've ever observed in any business, right? So restaurants pay for staffing, rent, equipment for whatever it is, 12, 18 hours of the day. And biologically, we can only eat for 3 hours of that day, right? So they have a really frustrating problem where no one is in their store 80% of the time. And then from 12 to 1, everyone is in their store, and they have to actually turn away demand, right? Because they actually can't fulfill the orders. And so that's incredibly frustrating for them to not be able to capture all of that. And so the answer is, to somehow flatten the demand curve. And so I think there's the answer in the end to all of these things. It's exactly what Uber had to do for transportation. It's dynamic pricing. So you have to, and in fact, it already exists in the restaurant space. It's called happy hour, and we've all taken advantage of it. But just sort of turning that into something very methodical. So in New York, for example, we offer small point incentives for people who order before 11 or 11:30 in our busiest spots. And the idea is to just like pull the demand curve out a bit so that the more orders that restaurants can fulfill from 11 to 11:30, it frees up their capacity, their peak capacity from 12 to 1 to serve even more orders. So in fact, in a weird way, it actually just benefits us because we can send them more orders if they have more fulfillment capacity, right?
I want to get back to some of the changes that are coming in the food court, but there's questions coming in from our Facebook audience. One is the most common feedback you get from Ritual users. We get a ton of feedback and App Store reviews. I think people are just feeling like this is an app that makes the little things in their day and their life better, right? It by just saving them time and little annoyances and 10 or 15 minutes here and then. I think that's what we believed, was that if we could, if you can take something, even though we're not saving people hours at a time, but it's something that they do 2 or 3 times a day, and if we can remove the friction out of that experience, that's very helpful. We get a lot of feedback from people that are on fixed shifts. And sometimes they'll say, look, I get exactly a 30-minute break and everyone gets it at the same time, and I'm usually wasting 15 minutes of that in line, and that sucks. And if I can order it in advance, I actually get my full break. So we get feedback like that from, a lot of very super positive feedback from users. I think increasingly some of the interesting feedback is coming from our restaurant partners on how we're really helping them. I mean, for them, this is their livelihood, and it's rewarding to see
how they can run their businesses better.
What's their biggest aha, or the most common aha you get from restaurant operators?
I mean, it's a lot of things. For some of them, when we launch new markets and with the demand we can drive, we in London recently, a lot of restaurants in the city, posted on social and even sent us feedback that they had their best 2 weeks of sales in the history of their business during those 2 weeks, right? So that's a feel-good thing to hear. I think just the tools that we provide them and the understanding that they have on what's working and what's not working in their restaurants it's one of those things, like once you give people that, those types of data and insights, it's hard to imagine how you ran a business without them,
Right. So you mentioned food courts, and I find them fascinating. They're crazy, and what Ritual and other companies like yours are doing is really kind of mucking with the design, because they're not designed for the digital user.
Yeah.
You're working with real estate companies, the developers who design food courts. What do they need to change to take a bit of the craziness out of the zoo of food courts?
So it's 2 or 3 pretty simple things that you'll see in all new food courts being built out from this point on, and even restaurants being built out from this point on. So I think the first one is the order and pickup windows are going to be much more separated than they are today, because they're usually the flow was you go in, you order, then you go pick up. But now most people are just coming to pick up. And so in physical, even in non-food court environments, what you're seeing now is the reverse order. So as soon as you walk into a restaurant, you get pick up first, then the order station behind, because most people don't need to actually order, right? So in food courts, we're starting to see them get put on opposite sides as opposed to closer together. The 2 biggest ones are most restaurants and most food courts aren't designed for 50 orders waiting for pickup, right? They just don't have enough shelving space for it. So what we're seeing is vertical shelving is typically the solution. So you'll see a lot of stores that we work with and a lot of food courts are starting to now put vertical shelving in, and in fact even there are staffing changes, because you don't need as many cashiers. You almost need like a concierge to help people find, when there's 50 orders waiting for pickup, you might actually need to help people find their order. So we start to see stores doing things like that.
So what's vertical shelving? Sounds like I'm going to have to get on a ladder to go get.
You don't have to get on a ladder, but it's typically 4 or 5. I mean, think of it as like a bookshelf. And
I'm going to need a ladder.
You might.
But you'll have shelving, so.
Yeah, they already do.
Sounds efficient.
Most restaurants and a lot of food courts have already put shelving in. And then the last one that we see is having a separate kitchen for digital orders. And so having almost a separate line or a separate prep space so that they're not interweaving walk-ins with digital.
That's great. Last time I was at a McDonald's in a local food court, I thought there was going to be a fist fight, because there was this mob. There must have been 50 people dealing with the frustration that you talked about, and one poor person who was sort of thrown over the counter to act as concierge, sort of sorting people out and trying to get bags and cups to people. I mean, it's not designed for, as you said, the digital experience. Mm-hmm. But you used an interesting word earlier of fulfillment, which people like Amazon also like to use. But that's an interesting challenge for any service provider. What do you mean by when you say fulfillment?
Just making an order and prepping a meal or an order or a coffee for someone else. And what we find is that the bottlenecks tend to be fulfillment capacity. So if we can send, even if we could send 8,000 orders to a restaurant, if they actually can't fulfill more than 150 of them an hour, that starts to become the bottleneck. So one of our big focuses, and again, we're aligned with our partners here, it's how to help them, because sending orders is one thing, but it's like you mentioned the Groupon problem of, if you've got a lineup of 1,000 people, well, if you've got a virtual lineup of 1,000 people that you can't fulfill, that's equally problematic. So using data and insights to help restaurants get operationally better, to fulfill orders faster and with less time is also something that we work with them on.
Let's talk about your expansion plans. It's really exciting what you've got on the go in the U.S. and Australia. I talked about your ambitions to 3x this year. First of all, what took you so long to go global?
We actually launched Chicago as our second city after Toronto, and until very recently, so we went right away to after Toronto to Chicago and New York. But it took us something like 2 years to do 2 cities, and I think sometimes when you want to go fast, I think what we learned was it's not about how fast you go from 1 to 5, it's about how fast you can go from 5 to 50. And it's really counterintuitive because we see a lot of startups rush too quickly to launch their second or third city, and they think that the faster they get to number 2 and 3, the faster they're going to get to city number 50. The problem with going too early is it's hard to experiment with a bigger base of cities. So what we found was by keeping it very small. So in fact, we didn't even do Toronto. For a year, we were in a single neighborhood, and it took us probably 9 to 12 months to launch two neighborhoods. But by keeping it small, we were able to just iterate on product and process really fast. We were able to make a bunch of mistakes, learn from them quicker because you weren't supporting 3 cities at that time, right? So it took us a very, very long time to go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3, but we'd gone through probably 100 iterations at that point. And so it was one of those, like, we measured so many times that we knew exactly how to run the playbook. And then after that, we went from 3 to 10 pretty fast, and now we'll go from 10 to 50 or 100 even faster.
What have you learned so far from the UK and Australia experiences?
That our playbook works really well. What's cool about it is there's differences in these markets, but at the end of the day, those differences are almost absorbed through the local restaurants. Like the restaurants and the makeup of a neighborhood reflects what people want, and so Ritual is just a connector, right? We're just connecting people in their neighborhood with restaurants and coffee shops in their neighborhood. So what we find is that the mix of things and the cuisine types, they almost take care of themselves. So oddly, not a lot is different for us. The product and the value proposition resonates just as well and seems to translate very well in different countries.
But Ritual is much more than a one-to-one experience. It's not just me as a consumer and a single supplier, and you're matching us. You've done some really interesting things. I'm thinking of Piggyback, of almost grouping or pooling consumers. Yeah. Tell us what you were thinking when you launched Piggyback, what you learned through some of the challenges of getting it going, and where you'd like to see it go in the next couple of years.
Yeah. So what we believe is, digital is better, right? And we like to think about what can we do on a digital platform that wasn't possible without. And again, it's the same analog to digital thing. So if you think about what Piggyback is, it's just a coffee run, right? And it's something that we observe that people do in the real world today, except you do it with 2 or 3 people that sit around you and you say, hey, I'm going to grab a coffee, do you want something? But through digital, we can enable this to happen across an entire floor or sometimes even across an entire company. We have companies like RBC that have thousands of employees across floors that are able to share lunch and coffee pickups with each other. And so that's something it's been a really powerful product for us. We're able to deliver value on all sides, right? For our end customers, it's sort of a free peer-to-peer delivery network. For restaurants, because we don't have to pay drivers, they're getting delivery-like incrementality without having to pay the really high fees that a lot of delivery companies charge. So we like things like that are positive on both sides of our network, and it really takes our platform to unlock that. So we invest really heavily in things like that.
Speaking of drivers, Uber Eats. Why do you think they're not in this space?
They actually are. So almost every single delivery company has pickup. DoorDash, Grubhub, Just Eat, Postmates, and Uber Eats. So I think that it's just not their main focus. At the end of it all, you are what you focus on. And so they're more logistics companies, and they're focused on how to deliver the right at the door experience to a customer, how to get food fast to you. We're focused on an amazing in-store experience, right?
With a workplace audience, that's pretty much what you're concentrating on.
Exactly. So even our demand curves are very different. Like delivery tends to be evenings and weekends. We tend to be the workday. So there, in some ways, it's. I mean, us and delivery are actually quite. They're complementary, more so than competitive. So coffees, again, it's a big focus for us. Tends not to be something that people get delivered. Not to say that delivery companies can't do pickup well, but they'd have to expend the kind of effort that we are on the space. So
there's a good health question that's come in from our Facebook audience about what Ritual can do, or maybe you're already doing, to help people eat healthier.
Yeah, I think a next phase for us is to really start to understand food. Today, the example again that I would draw on from retail is Amazon understands what a television or a camera is, right? They understand that it has certain attributes, and you're not just searching for a random product. So they've got deep knowledge about categories of products and attributes of those products and what those things mean. We think that local has to undergo that same thing. So really, in the case of food, it's what does it mean for something to be a burger or a salad or a coffee, and what are the attributes of this? And it goes beyond just healthy. It's even understanding things like dietary restrictions and certain diet types, helping people discover things that they might want. So I think an investment area for us is just understanding food better.
That's really interesting. It sounds like what a lot of financial services companies are doing, with more than just transacting money, but helping people understand what's going on as they're doing things with their phone, with money. How much are you going to be relying on AI in the future to help us all understand what we're eating, what we should be eating, and how to
in a pretty big way. In a pretty big way. I mean, we're starting out. There's already AI at work within Ritual right now. So certain types of recommendations and certain there are things that are already powered by machine learning. I think the biggest advantage we have is we have a really good data set. Right. We know, unlike the credit card companies that may know what restaurant you transacted on, we know a lot of specifics about what you eat, right? That when you go to this type of restaurant, you like to have a coffee and you like the specific sort of blueberry muffin from here, and that type of insight on exactly what you eat where can have some really powerful recommendations that are super personalized to people.
Another Facebook question about non-traditional food exchange, home-based, for instance. Do you foresee getting more into that space?
Probably not. It was something that we looked at one point. I think that there's a lot of food regulation around commercial kitchens and how food that has to be sold and the types of just health and safety checks that's required to sell food commercially. So I think that if people, as long as the product ends up being people paying for food in some way, there's a lot of just legal hurdles to get around using non-commercial kitchens for things like that. So it's likely not. I mean, it's possible that there's an interesting business to be built there, but I think for us that's something we're going to stay clear of.
You are starting to work more with companies, large employers, helping them sort of channel or help employees get food from what used to be called company canteens.
Yeah.
How big of a business is that going to be for you?
Yeah, employers are starting to become a meaningful part of the business right now. I think we're providing. There's interesting things going on. This didn't end up passing, but in the Bay Area, there was legislation that was going to go through on preventing large companies from actually building cafeterias in their campuses because of how much it hurts local businesses in their communities. And so it ended up not going through, but it was seriously considered. But I think what we're seeing is that businesses are trying to find easy ways of rewarding employees, and they can't. Even for companies who don't have, there's a stage of company where you can't afford to have that type of a cafeteria, but you want to provide a meal program for people, or at least a subsidy. And we just have found it's just very easy to use Ritual to do that, right? You just put you choose an amount, like $5 or $10 a day or a week or whatever cadence you want. Some companies actually do it monthly. They have just a monthly lunch that they like to buy employees, and we just make it's a super easy way, and people can just coordinate and get whatever they want. So we're starting to see a lot of uptake on programs like that.
So I'm thinking of other mass concentrations of people around food, and arenas, stadiums spring to mind. How much of an opportunity is that space for you?
Yeah, we think that there's a pretty big opportunity there. We're in early conversations with some of those folks. We actually do. Speaking of corporate cafeterias, we actually power a lot of corporate cafeterias as well. I think that in a lot of large banks, especially in New York, that have them, have just so many of their employees are using Ritual anyway that rather than building another app for their cafeteria, they just put their cafeteria on Ritual. So we're starting to make inroads into things like that. Corporate cafes, potentially airports, stadiums make a lot of sense. So yeah, I think they're all areas that we're exploring.
Great WebEx question here about packaging. Obviously a growing public concern about the amount of, especially plastic, non-recyclable packaging that comes with food and beverage. What do you think can be done through your business to reduce the amount of packaging waste?
This is a very good question. It's something that we talk about a lot. I think it's a very complicated problem because fundamentally a lot of this goes against convenience. When you talk about reusable containers and things like that, it's you're actually adding friction to something rather than making it more convenient. And I think that's why a lot of these things haven't worked. I think the approach that we're taking. So my view is this: I don't think that there is a simple answer here. I don't think it's going to be as simple as someone's going to invent some magical packaging that's going to solve everyone's problems. Nor do I think the answer. I mean, there are short-term answers on maybe getting people to choose to pay more for certain types of things, like we do with plastic bags at grocery stores. I think there's interesting opportunities when you combine groups of people, companies, and restaurants in the mix, and you say, well, is there a way that you can organize with a larger system to solve the problem? So again, the way we're thinking about it is it's how we solve most problems, which is let's break it down into something very small and let's solve the problem at our company first, right? So we ourselves are experimenting with a lot of things, but it's the same concept. If we can solve it for a building, then we can solve it at scale. Well, if we can solve it at our company, maybe we can solve it at more companies that look like our company. And if we can do it so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. I think it's too complicated and overwhelming to try to solve it at scale for everyone, right? And so, there was just one example of something very, very small that was very easy. Was at our company there's a lot of coffee runs, and we had those little cardboard sort of corrugated cardboard trays that are meant for 4 cups, and we just made a deal with the coffee shop near our office to say, like, look, rather than throwing these out, what if we stacked them up, and every week someone from our ops team would just drop it by, and you can recycle them. And so now everyone in our office, when they bring one of those things, we have a a 50 stack thing at the back of our office, and once a week someone goes and drops it off. And so again, it's these are examples of like they're small things. Maybe they're not going to work at all companies. Maybe they'll work at some. So again, our approach is let's try a bunch of things and see what works, and not try to solve the problem at scale.
It's a great challenge, though, to be taking on, and sounds like an opportunity for some bright minds to try to figure that out. Another question here from Facebook about your business model and how it changed from where you started. Our
business model hasn't changed very much. I think the business model is the same, which is, we make food more convenient and faster. And by doing that, we do two things. We introduce a lot of new people. So what we find is in every neighborhood, it's an interesting data point. In every neighborhood, 75% of, if you pick any restaurant, 75% of people within 500 meters have not tried that restaurant. Okay, so that's a number. It can be much higher in denser neighborhoods, but so on average. At a neighborhood scale, so when we look at it in a 500-meter radius, so that's about under a 5-minute walk, 75% of people haven't tried the restaurant. So again, we see what we do as two things. One is how do we introduce, as we see, the vast majority of people in a neighborhood to a restaurant, right? That they haven't tried. So that's how we drive new users. And the second thing is for people who have been there, how do we make it more convenient so that they're going to go back more often? And that's how we view incremental demand. It's new customers and making it easier so that your existing customers go back more often. And we take a transaction fee for driving that incremental demand.
So your expansion plans, ambitious and impressive. Curious what you think are the biggest near-term barriers to hitting the targets that you've laid out.
I think for us, one of a new challenge over the last 6 months is, as we've grown our team now to hundreds of people, how we organize ourselves is starting to become really important. So when a team is under 100 people, everyone just kind of knows what they need to do. And you don't really need that like management layer of how to organize and coordinate, and which is why it's amazing how fast small companies it can make a 10x difference, right? So sometimes it's like small companies of under 100 people can sometimes do what it takes teams of 500 to 800, just because the management overhead of coordinating people makes you move so slowly. So I think that's our biggest challenge, is how do we, as we scale the number of people, how do we keep moving? I think one of our core reasons for success is how fast we could move, right? How fast we can try things, it's like the faster we fail, the faster we learn. And the more things we can do, and that's been our success. One of the main reasons for our success. So it's important to not lose that as we scale, and that's probably the thing that keeps me up the most at night.
So we talk a lot about failure through the Disruptor series, and you've used some interesting terms around the velocity of failure.
Yeah.
Curious if you can expand a bit on that and share what you've learned about not just failure, but the velocity of failure.
Yeah. I think if you look at anything that's worked for us, and it took me a long time to wrap my head around this, even through my career and my own learning and growth, which was 10 or 15 years ago, I really viewed failure as failure, and I think it's taken me a long time to realize that everything that's worked has had a string of learnings. And you can call them learnings, or you can call them failures, whatever you choose. Even with Piggyback, we had to throw the product out 3 times. Like we rebuilt it from the ground up like 3 times. So it failed. It failed until it worked, right? And I think most things we did or have done have just gone through tens, if not hundreds of failure attempts. And so I think one of the things that we decided when building Ritual was that building a company or a team of people that doesn't make mistakes is a fool's errand. And what we should do instead is figure out how to detect failure quickly and fix it fast, right? So I think that's what we're good at. It's identifying challenges, fixing it quickly, and building that type of resilience as a company. I also think that words are sometimes managers and leaders can give very contradictory messages. You can't say that it's okay to fail and then punish people for it. So we celebrate these types of learnings. So
how do you do that?
Well, so I think the difference between learning and failure is, do you share the learning or not, right? So if you fail at something and you try to bury it, that actually is a failure, because no one's learned from that. We do postmortems on everything that goes wrong, and it's distributed really widely. It's like, even if we have an engineering infrastructure failure, there's a postmortem on like what happened, what was the learning, what have we fixed, what are we going to do differently next time. And by making it not a taboo topic and people not feeling like that's going to be held, in fact, if you publicly broadcast your learning, you'll be rewarded for that. I think that's one way. But I think there's just a series, like, you can't say that you have high tolerance for failure, but then also expect people to spend a lot of time trying stuff out. So this was my point on like the cringe test. Like, you can't put a lot of pressure on teams to say deliver things faster, but instead the right argument that we have is, what can we cut, right? Does it really need to be that polished? Can we cheat and just fake this or do that, right? So I think we really focus on removing things that aren't necessary to try things quickly, and I assume that the first time you do everything is going to fail, right? So then the point is, if it's going to fail, then why hyper polish it? Just do it as simply as you can to get a learning or a data point, and we'll go from there.
It's an amazing story, what you're building and what lies ahead. I was curious what you've learned about yourself as a leader through this.
I think that growth, just learning to grow, is a skill set in itself. And I think that when I look at all of the people at our company that have been successful over the last 4 years, because we've gone, I think our team has quadrupled in the last 18 months, and we've gone from one city to 4 countries. I think what I found is people that are able to put their ego aside and admit that in spite of being somewhat successful in certain things, that at the end of the day you probably know very little, and a lot of what you know is probably wrong, and being open to just having a beginner's mind on it. And I think that's what we try to do, is that the reason why we keep getting better is we assume that we still don't have it figured out, and I think that's a really hard balance. It's like success makes you not lose that mindset. So I think that's something that we try very hard to preserve, which is, we don't know everything, and even if it worked, it could be better. So I think that's something that, and even with my own leadership style and management, it's like sometimes things are working, but it could be a lot better, and we just try to keep an open mind to learning and growth.
It's a great message to leave us with. As a token of our appreciation, we make a charitable contribution in the name of our guest, and Ray's chosen the Daily Bread Food Bank. Mm-hmm. Maybe not surprising there, but maybe you can tell us a bit about why you chose Daily Bread.
I think food security is just an important thing for communities, and Daily Bread does a tremendous amount of good work, just providing, just in a very non-discriminatory way, providing food to, empowers a lot of food banks in our communities, and I just feel like the work they do is very important and for the greater good of our city. So.
Well, I'd like to thank our audiences for both here in person and virtual for joining us today, and a special thanks to one of my team members, Jennifer Marin, who is the captain of RBC Disruptors. She makes this happen. She's going on parental leave. Jen, thank you for all you've done for Disruptors, and we wish you the best of times in the months ahead. Ray, thank you so much for being part of RBC Disruptors.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. It was a pleasure to do it.
And please mark your calendars for our next Disruptors is Thursday, May 23rd. We'll be live at the